So welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a few moments. I'm really glad to be here with you. My name is Dr. Michael Chingaris. I'm the chair of the Somatic Experiencing Research Committee within the board. And I am really excited to be here with you at our inauguration of the SE Research Salon. This will be a monthly presentation, or at least a quarterly presentation series as we go forward, where we get to highlight the powerful work in somatic experiencing research and research in the wider somatic community. And so what we're talking about here when we talk about SE research is we're talking fundamentally about a shift in the culture and the containment for research within body-based psychotherapies as a whole. And I'm really grateful to be sharing with you today the work of two incredibly powerful leaders in this work. And I'll mention a little bit about who they are and what they bring in just a moment. But first, I just want to say that as we're doing this cultural shift, it's really important that, that as we move into this, we also realize that research cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires fundraising, donation, and generosity. And that as we give, we actually are able to widen our impact. It is really that concrete. And in many ways, the impact of SE research and research into somatic therapies as a whole is at the fundament of some of the public health crisis we face today, things from the impact of the pandemic of racism to the way that hypertension and trauma overlap to create a higher risk of early death, to the way that Alzheimer's manifests with 50% increase when you have individuals who have PTSD. So I'm grateful to be here and to be supporting the growth of this wider swath of research within the SE community. And I'll invite you both to share your talent and frankly your donations with the SE Research Committee's fundraising process. So I want to highlight a little bit of the work that we're doing in the committee so you know who we are and what's going on. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Pat Sikora, who has been an impeccable guide, leader, cat herder. You may or may not know this, but people with a PhD and researchers are not the easiest to get into the same room at the same time and to get everybody on the same page. And Pat is a leader with intellectual acumen and depth and consummate grace. And I'm really grateful for how she's carrying and leading us forward. And when you write research at the SE Foundation, who you're getting is Dr. Sikora. And she's an absolute grace. Do you want to say anything, Dr. Sikora?
I'm just so grateful to be here, and I'm so excited to have this presentation to kick off the salons, to highlight the work of Dr. Walling and Dr. Kolach, and just have the conversation start. So I'm really excited about this, and I'm gonna stay quiet so everyone else can enjoy the speakers. So thanks.
Thank you. And we have five kind of groups. Some of them are full subcommittees. Some of them are working groups that are focusing on how to promote and develop SE research. One of them is fundraising and grants work group. Another one is community building and mentorship work group. Another one is developing an incredibly powerful, well-designed and well thought out white paper that articulates the theoretical and the scientific roots of somatic experiencing, as well as the current research literature. We have a committee and a work group that's looking at building organizational collaborations. If you're part of a university that would like to collaborate, please reach out. And then we have a policy and strategy work group that is building some of the support that allows somatic research to do what it does, because somatic research is fundamentally interdisciplinary, and many treatments require interdisciplinary work, but lots of them are taught in silos. So there's need for some things that truly support what an integrated somatic model is. And I would like to also highlight that somatic experiencing is part of a family of somatic therapies and body-based psychotherapies that are much wider and much bigger, and that we have a big role to play in that, but it is a role within a movement that is part of a launching wave, and SE is glad to be a part of that family and support that family. And then that leads me into wanting to tell you who Dr. Walling is a little bit. I've had the honor of working with Dr. Walling on the research committee at SE for a while. He is an incredibly grounded, deeply intellectually savvy and individual who brings acumen in both fundraising, research development, and development for the field. He has been the president of the USABP, helping lead forward all of our somatic communities and setting the foundation for that. And many of this work, much of this work comes out of his leadership in that area. And I feel truly grateful to share him with you, so that you get to know who he is and know the power of his intellect and his presence. And this project that we're talking about today is a pairing project with the Trauma Research Consortium out of the Kinsey Institute, and Dr. Walling has secured a solid foundation that allows for the steady creation of a research model that can carry forward for a long time. And I know that you will get some great information about that. And the director of that research is Dr. Koach. And while I have not seen Dr. Koach very much before now, I have learned a lot about his work over the last few months and grown a lot of respect for his impact, his discipline, and his thoughtful approach. Dr. Koach brings both a depth of personal reflection and a commitment to studying how psychobiological factors play and shape well-being for individuals and their physical and mental health. And as the managing director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium, he oversees a large network of hundreds of trauma therapists around the world. And there will be lots of impact from his work and many, many studies to come. And so I feel very grateful to introduce you to a current leader who has much, much more leadership to come. And without any further ado, I am going to back off the screen and just become one of the listeners. And I'm grateful to share Dr. Walling and Dr. Koach's work with you. Did anything you all, Dr. Walling and Dr. Koach, that I missed you want to highlight?
No, thank you so much, Michael. Before I pull up a brief deck to guide the presentation, I do want to just say that there will be two presentations back to back, and then we really hope to open it up to dialogue to the participants who are attending live today. If you're not familiar with the history of the United States Association for Body Psychotherapy, I just want to give you context before I pull up the slides and lose your eyes and your attention into that material. The USABP is a professional organization that has dedicated itself to advancing the field of somatic psychology for several decades. Among our members in the community at large are really the founding organizations that are comprised of approximately 24 or more, give or take the year and the way membership works, of training institutes, including Core Energetics, Bioenergetics, Bodynamics, Rubenfeld Synergy Methods, Gestalt psychotherapists, Hakomi psychotherapists, integrative somatics folks, and of course, SE practitioners. The USABP, a couple of decades back, started itself in order to promote and sustain the standards and the ethics of the profession of somatic psychotherapy. And our mission and our goal is to involve as many activities that promote somatic psychology, body psychotherapy, and mind-body practices. And that includes, of course, the publication of our journal with our sister organization in Europe, which is the European Association for Body Psychotherapy. We, as a board within the organization, we provide oversight to the day-to-day operations through our executive committee, but much of our work is really focused on advancing scholarship and research. So to that end, it brings me to what we are doing with the TSRC. So let me share with you those slides. Let me pull that up. So the collaboration with the TSRC goes back to when Dr. Stephen Porges received the Pioneer Award at our Congress a few years ago at Pacifica Graduate Institute. It was during conversations with Dr. Porges that we identified an opportunity through the pursuit of a worldwide trauma therapist database that he had kind of a twinkle in his eye that was beginning at that time. And this database was really set up from his perspective to capture the narratives and the lived experience, not only of trauma psychotherapists, but also of the folks for whom that trauma psychotherapists served. And that hinges itself, of course, upon this rich history of our field that you heard me allude to. This image comes from the recent issue, the winter issue of the International Body Psychotherapy Journal. And embedded within this diagram, this sort of graphic representation of pioneers within the field, you will see familiar faces. You will see, folks like Dr. Levine, Dr. Porges, Dr. Alan Shore, Jaak Panskep, many others, Damasio, for whom we all, perhaps if we're still writing papers ourselves, or if we're beginning just to start in the field you're learning about in your textbooks, who really influence the kind of intersectional scholarship that our journal talks about. This particular author who made this graphic representation is from Italy and is the head of the Italian Society of Reichian Analysis. Her name is Luisa Barbato. But the sort of ontological perspective that we really take in somatic psychotherapy has multiple tributaries that come not only from the fields of somatic praxis, but also from psychoanalytic histories, humanistic psychological processes, and even the current literature today in clinical psychotherapy talks about the future of interventional science as being largely based upon these kinds of process-based therapies. And as perhaps Dr. Koach may allude to in his presentation, through our collaboration with the TSRC as the survey process has unfolded internationally, he, along with many of us and at the consortium, are learning just how many psychotherapies that there are that fall under this broad tent of rich traditions and lineages that have all cross-pollinated themselves over time. And of course, that leads us to applications of these many theoretical contributions, including randomized clinical trials that you've seen in recent years, over the last 2 years, of SE itself placed within an RCT model. This, for example, is a paper that comes from our colleagues from Anderson and his group in Europe, looking at SE in an RCT for low back pain comorbid with PTSD and SE. And it's these types of studies that really invite deep and powerful research questions that we hope that the TSRC will help us address, not just for the future of SE, but also for the future of trauma psychotherapy as a whole. And many of you may be familiar with existing models that have informed some of the SE research that you may have encountered in previous years. The most significant of which is, of course, polyvagal theory, which underpins much of the scholarship that you see coming out of the TSRC, given that its founder is Dr. Stephen Porges. And naturally, as a part of how SE pedagogy is currently employed throughout the trainings, this model has, of course, really influenced the field of trauma psychotherapy as a whole, and certainly helps us illustrate some of the ways that we might conceptualize our specific aims of research design. As a clinician, the real application of the research that comes out of TSRC, though, for me, in my collaboration with Dr. Koach and the team, has always been surrounding these questions of application in clinical practice. As some of you may be aware, the American Psychological Association developed practice guidelines for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder not but a few years ago. But as many in the field of body psychotherapy have brought to the attention of the APA, there is still an underrepresentation of what we see in clinical practice in these guidelines. Namely, that somatic psychotherapies was dramatically underrepresented, barring, of course, the inclusion of best practice guidelines that were established for the use of EMDR in clinical practice. And this brings into question, of course, the limitations of how research grows beyond the gold standard of RCTs, more along the lines of beginning in these kind of small pilot studies that look at survey research to give us further questions that then advance our insights, that then allow us to sort of really look at how we are doing trauma psychotherapy in our own practices today. The implications, of course, are that it allows us to think about the interactive dynamics that we use within the various models that we apply, and certainly within somatic experiencing praxis, that allow us to consider how we might help really identify a protocol that could be replicated far and beyond any research bias that we ourselves as practitioner of the discipline may bring to a certain study, and that allow for the underlying mechanisms or common factors to be extrapolated so that we can help the field as a whole continue to grow right along with us. Even in my own personal research of SE theory and its etiologies of cross-pollination from other areas, even Dr. Levine, as founder of the theory, has noted that there had to be greater exploration into things like biomarkers, looking at, let's say, for example, telomerase activity, and perhaps the resulting impact pre and post of an SE intervention. And of course, funding is the major barrier to the future of that research. And so naturally, we have to develop collaborations like those with the TSRC so that we have meaningful data sets that we can then actually pull some of our papers out of to then explore how we might develop such a protocol that would allow itself to be replicated at other organizations and institutes. In terms of further exploration, as ever, I have to give a brief and quick plug to invite you that if research is of interest to you, if you really want to take some of your own clinical experiences and write them up in the form of a case study and to submit them to our journal at the International Body Psychotherapy Journal, our our door is always open. The peer review process is one of the most collaborative. This is a labor of love that's entirely peer driven by volunteers, and for the last 20 years has really allowed somatic psychotherapists from all traditions to be able to share their clinical work as well as their research and their scholarship. So I wanted to turn it over though to Dr. Koach so that he might be able to give us more of a broader overview of the dynamics of the TSRC and what they're finding in this amazing survey that I alluded to that Dr. Porges, along with Dr. Koach, launched a few years ago. So, Jacek?
Thank you, Dr. Walling. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hopefully successfully. Let's try one more time. Visible? Great. So my name is Jacek Kołacz, and I'm the chief scientist with the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium at Indiana University, which is based out of the Kinsey Institute. There's a few things that I want to achieve today with the presentation. One is, what I want to do is provide an introduction to our consortium, the work that we do. At any one time, we have several dozen studies, and I want to just give you all a flavor for the types of work that we do, the types of collaborations that we have with clinics, hospitals, and therapists. One specific study that I want to hone in on today also is our trauma therapist survey. This is a large international survey that we've done looking at trauma therapist practice, the types of clients that they see, their own personal histories. And then I want to end the presentation with a little bit of a background, or for many of you, probably a refresher on polyvagal theory and how we've used it to develop some of the measures that we provide for tracking therapy progress. And at this point, I just want to step away for 1 second because a cat is in trouble again, as Dr. Welling knows from our meetings.
Okay, yeah. So sometimes what happens during research meetings at the TSRC is that Jacek and I will be talking and the cat will get trapped in the door and Jacek will have to relieve said cat. So glad that you could save the cat once again, Jacek.
Yes. So there is a cat here in Bloomington, Indiana, which also happens to be the home of the Kinsey Institute, and sometimes she needs to be let out and makes that known very loudly. But this is where we're based out of, Bloomington, Indiana here. This is our campus, and Lindley Hall here in the top left. That's our home where we're based out of at the Kinsey Institute. I want to say a little bit about our core scientific team. So the TSRC was founded in 2017 by Dr. Porges. I've become the managing director and chief scientist after doing a postdoc with Dr. Porges. And we've grown quite a bit over the last few years to encompass Erica Buram, our consortium coordinator, Deb Dana, who's our clinical advisor, Chris Walling, Kate Volofsky, who have done tremendous work to help support our research and to help us make connections outside of the research world and to really bring what we're doing out to the forefront of therapy. I want to thank our students and colleagues in the Socio-Neural Physiology Laboratory who do a lot of the engineering and programming work that makes our work possible, and Olivia Roth and Evan Nix, who work very close with me to develop ways to present the data, helped a lot with this presentation. I also want to thank our funders. A lot of our support over the years has come from the dedication of USABP and the Dillon Fund, as well as the NIH, Chaya Foundation, the Fitzgerald Family Donor Fund, our collaboration with the EABP, and Dysautonomia International. I think all of this speaks to the range of types of issues and questions that we look at and how we integrate perspectives across basic research and across applied research and clinical trials. I do want to say a little bit about the range of methods that we use for our studies. In the past few years, there has been an explosion of affordable, easy to use devices for measuring autonomic physiology. There's so many devices out there that now do what, say, $20,000, $30,000 equipment in the lab used to do. Now, a lot of these devices, I would say, are not research grade, but quite a few are. And we've been working with hospitals, therapy clinics, and even sometimes with individual practitioners to implement data collection with these devices to provide support for analysis and processing. And it's become a very rich stream of data for us. One other thing that we have been developing and implementing is using the voice as a measure of physiological state. The larynx and the pharynx, the muscles around the throat, are what give vocalizations their color, their texture, their emotional meaning, and the pathways that innervate those muscles are deeply integrated with the autonomic nervous system through connections in the brainstem. And we found that we can use the voice as a non-invasive way to look at client state in our assessments of therapy efficacy and in our basic research. One other thing that we've been developing in the lab is the PhysioCam. This is an alternative to contact physio measures. This came out of a need for a non-contact measure of physiology where sensors were just not going to be useful, especially in populations who have sensory hypersensitivities, who don't tolerate sensors on their body very well. So with every beat of your heart, there is a rush of oxygenated blood to the face and a slight change in color. Now, we can't pick that up with the naked eye, but with the right filters, with the right type of camera, we can use that to measure the pulse wave and get a measure of heart rate variability. And we do a lot of work in developing self-reports that are based on neurophysiology. This I'll talk quite a bit about later on in the talk, and you'll see some of the results that we've had from studies using these self-reports. So before I dig into any data, I want to give a little bit of a perspective on research. So working in research is an incredibly humbling experience. I realize day in and day out what a small sliver of experience we really capture with research. But I think it's a very important sliver, and I think it's a sliver that gets smarter over time. It gets smarter through feedback that we get about the measurements that we develop, It gets smarter through the discussions that we have in interpreting the information that we have, and it gets richer through the conversations that we have about what's missing or what we're not capturing. And a lot of our ideas for measurement come from conversations with therapists, finding out what's important to them, what they're seeing in practice that's not being captured, and we actively try to use that information to inform the measures that we develop. But what I think we can do with that sliver is that we help to build an understanding of the world. We can aggregate information from a lot of cases and use that to understand what's happening in practice, what's working, and to understand a little bit about the mechanisms or the processes that we want to target with therapy. It provides a structured, formal way to share information. And it helps start conversations about it. Research is increasingly becoming an issue of accessibility, where clinics, policymakers, and insurance companies base decisions on what will be available to clients or what will be affordable to clients based on research. And so it's become an incredible and important source of building accessibility. It tests our assumptions. We as humans are built to learn very quickly. And often that learning can be biased. It can be based on very little information. And one thing that happens for me, the more that I do research, is the more I feel and I know my assumptions about the world are tested. And then finally, it's food for discussion. It gets conversation started. I love being able to share our data with a wide variety of perspectives to be able to learn what other people see in the data or what they were not seeing in the data that we're missing. And so I'm hoping that in the discussion that comes out of this presentation, I'll be able to learn a little bit from the people here today. And also, before I get into the data, I also want to make a dedication to the trauma survivors and to the helpers who have the confidence and give us the privilege to understand and to share their stories. I know that not everyone gets to work with this kind of information. Not everyone is privileged to collect it. And I'm incredibly mindful of that privilege and grateful to everyone in our network. So the TSRC Therapist Network is something that we began building in 2018. It's an international group of clinicians and researchers who come together to study the science of safety and connection. We've grown over the years to 838 members. About a third, and actually now more than a third, are located outside the US. And what the network is a way to pool information from across therapists all over the world. And one way that we do this is through our therapist member survey. So anyone who joins the network is invited to fill out a survey. We've had an incredible response rate here of over 80% of our members have completed this and provided us information on their client base, the kinds of cases that they're working with, their own background, practice, the methods that they use, as well as their own trauma histories, their health, and their well-being. And so I'll be sharing some of that data today. So one thing that I think helps to introduce our network is to think about who the therapists are working with. So these are the therapist reported reasons that clients have for seeking therapy. As you can see, trauma, anxiety, depression are number one, but there's a range of different types of clinical issues that our therapists are working with. And we do want to take into account that incredible diversity. And so if we zero in on trauma, we also see that incredible diversity. So this is a therapist-centric plot in that this is the amount of therapists who report that their clients have these types of trauma histories. And again, we see that there's this incredible diversity here of the types of histories that clients are coming to their therapists with. And all of these are going to inform the way that therapy progresses and the types of decisions that therapists make. I do also want to say one thing about the personal histories of trauma therapists. So we know that trauma is pervasive. The blue bars here are data that we've collected from a general population in the US, and they're pretty similar to rates that we see all over the world from other studies, where histories of emotional abuse, emotional neglect, sexual abuse, physical neglect, and physical abuse are quite common. They're part of the human experience. And one thing that we're learning about our trauma therapists is that there's quite a bit of trauma history there as well. And there's that lived experience that we know is a part of the reason that some of our therapists go into the work that they do. One of the, I think, most interesting pieces of what we've been learning is about the types of methods that therapists use. So we found that there are over 100 different types of methods that therapists report in our survey. And on average, therapists are using 8 methods. So there's quite a bit of diversity here. I'm just listing the top 20 methods here. And I will just say a little bit about some of these top ones. So polyvagal informed therapy comes up quite a bit. So for me, this is more of a framework that's applicable to a lot of different types of therapies. And I think that's part of the reason that it's so popular among our therapists. But when we look next to the first method of working with clients, somatic experiencing is really being reported as one of the top, if not the top method that therapists are using. One of the other things that we've learned about SE is the incredible dedication to training and support that SE therapists have. So on average, when we ask therapists about their methods, we ask how many of them have had formal training in that particular method. And in general, just about half are using methods that they have been formally trained in. And that percentage is quite a bit higher for somatic experiencing, which I think speaks to the incredible commitment that SC has had to developing accessible and excellent training to their therapists. And one of the other things that we ask, and this is the data that I really do want to highlight, especially in this presentation, is our questions about ratings of effectiveness. So out of all the methods that our therapists are using, we ask them, when you include this method as a part of training, how often do you see the client benefit? I'm sorry, not training, as a part of therapy. So polyvagal informed therapy pops up again, and I think that's partly because it's applicable to so many different types of methods. But again, SE stands out here as being one of the most highly rated as far as effectiveness for clients. Now, this is on a scale of 0 to 4, 0 being never, 4 being always. And so as you can see, as far as these top 20 most popular, most used methods, all of them are on average at least sometimes effective. But there is a very clear gradient here, and somatic experiencing is being reported as being quite effective. Here's just one way to look at the data. We've got the percent of trauma workers who are using the method along the y-axis, and how often those trauma workers are reporting that they see client benefit, and somatic experiencing here pops up as particularly highly used and particularly effective. And when I see data like this, I think it's exciting, but it's also a call to action. That I think that what therapists are seeing in their practice here is not making it into the literature, and is not being particularly documented. I mean, Dr. Walling did bring up that there are several RCTs now that are available on SE, but but that literature is still quite small. And so I'm hoping that part of this can be a pat on the back that SE is effective and being used very often, but it also a call to action. So I want to pivot at this point in the presentation to a little bit about the tools that we've been developing to help track participant outcomes in therapy. And so I think part of this is going to come from a framework of thinking about safety and threat and trauma, which many of you are likely already familiar with, but I do want to provide this as a background. So as mammals inhabiting nervous systems, we need to negotiate our environment. And we have systems that help promote safety in safe contexts. And here on the left, this is my cat Penny with my other housemate, my wife, Nancy, in a state of safety, sleeping together, relaxed. But one thing that we also need to do because of the world that we face is occasionally to mobilize to meet danger, or in extreme circumstances, we have some systems that respond to life threat. And so part of the story here and the transitions that we make is the autonomic nervous system. It's important for maintaining our typical body processes and also for responding to threats. And we have physiological states that promote safe, calm social engagement, that promote mobilization, or that promote this behavioral shutdown or immobilization. And we do know that because the autonomic nervous system is involved in this, we can use it as a way to understand the internal physiological states in a range of conditions. And we do see a well-documented literature of autonomic nervous system disruption in people who have a diagnosis of PTSD, anxiety, autism, people who have gastrointestinal dysfunction, chronic pain, Ehlers-Danlos. We see that this cuts across many diagnoses. And we also know that the autonomic nervous system is particularly sensitive to developmental tuning, that the conditions in our environment help shape the type of responses that are on the autonomic nervous system develops. And part of that helps to understand, provide some background to understand how we get to the nervous system that we have. And part of it also helps us understand how do we work with the autonomic nervous system to get it toward the type of function that we would want. And so from polyvagal theory, which was developed by Stephen Porges, who is our founding director, we know that the autonomic nervous system is valuable in the moment, but these chronic threat response states impede our safety-related function and our ability to engage with others. And part of the story here that we learn is also from the anatomy and the evolutionary history, in that we have these multiple branches of the autonomic nervous system. So in the green up here, we've got the ventral vagal complex, and that's our evolutionarily newest system. And it's also our least costly. If we're using this branch of the autonomic nervous system to regulate, it innervates and it affects only structures above the diaphragm. So gastrointestinal function can continue. We've got minimal effects throughout the body. But as we move into some of these older systems, we increasingly increase the toll that the reactivity has on our body. So the sympathetic nervous system, our fight flight mobilization system, has innervation through a lot more of the body than the VVC. And so when it activates, we see a lot more of the symptoms on the typical body processes. And it does innervate quite a bit in the gut, though it's not quite as active in regulating the gut as our last system, the dorsal vagal complex. The dorsal vagal complex is crucial to a lot of digestive function. And when it is challenged, now we can have really serious disruption of metabolic activity in the body. And one thing that understanding this anatomy gives us is that we can now use the body to inform measures in our understanding of what is happening in the autonomic nervous system. So we most likely don't know our autonomic state at any one moment, but we can feel its effects. And so any one organ can have its own unique reason for acting up. But when we combine information from multiple organs, now we can build an overall profile of the autonomic nervous system. And this is what we've tried to do with the body perception questionnaire. We have items that clients or research participants can report on to say how often they feel disruption in these organs. And we can sum that information to understand what is happening with the autonomic nervous system. So there are two sections of the body perception questionnaire. We have a measure of body awareness and a measure of autonomic reactivity, which is that functional disruption of organs. Higher autonomic reactivity scores are going to mean that there's greater autonomic disruption, likely because we're moving out of ventral vagal regulation into sympathetic or dorsal vagal regulation that is going to be more costly on the body. And we've validated this self-report with sensor-based autonomic measures in the lab. And because of our incredible research and clinical network, it's now available in over 20 languages, and there's been quite a few now validation and psychometric studies on these languages. And we do find that the factor structure, the organization of the items tends to be quite consistent language to language, and that the BPQ tends to work very similarly across the languages that we've seen it translated into. So it's available free to use. We have a scale that's available for anyone and a manual. You can email me directly at my IU email address, or email us at the consortium email address, which I will have at the end of the talk. I want to highlight a few findings that we've had with the body perception questionnaire that helps to contextualize how it works, what it's capturing, and how it could be used in practice. So this is data from several thousand research participants. And what we've got here along the x-axis are the reported number of adverse events in a person's life. And we know that adverse events are just part of life, but we can use this as a crude measure of how many things have happened to a person that might move their autonomic nervous system toward threat reactions. And on the y-axis, we've got self-reported autonomic reactivity from the BPQ. And what we see is there's a pretty tight association here with more numbers of adverse events being related to higher autonomic reactivity and higher toll on those organs that are innervated by the autonomic nervous system. I also want to share some preliminary data from a recent study. This is data that was collected by Helen Grooten, who's a collaborator of ours in the Netherlands. And she collected data from 30 of her clients who were going through sound therapy called the Safe and Sound Protocol. And she collected pre and post measures on the body perception questionnaire and found that compared to population average scores at the pre-assessment autonomic reactivity was substantially higher than average in her clients. And after the SSP, those scores on average moved down to that population average. So this is just one example of how the BPQ can be used in practice. So the BPQ is just one of the questionnaires that we've been developing in our lab. Another is the brain-body center sensory scales, and we found that that's also been sensitive for picking up treatment response in sensory domains. We have the purpose in life measure, which we've been also including in more and more of our trials to look at treatment efficacy. And then we've got 2 scales in development that should be available by the end of the year. One is the partner social engagement scale, and this came out of our conversations with therapists who were saying they were using an intervention and their client went home and the client's partner came back and said, I'm seeing all of these changes. So we've been developing a measure that can capture some of those social engagement features like changes in eye contact, body posture, the sound of the voice that we can use to get a reporter or data from a reporter who's living or who has access to that client outside of the therapy session. And then one other measure that we've been developing is a feeling of safety, which is going to help us understand the internal sensations and feelings that come from feeling safe or feeling that the environment is dangerous or threatening. And this came out of our conversations with trauma workers who were noticing that there are these important aspects to feeling safe in certain contexts like medical settings that are going to impact how treatment is received by the client and perhaps maybe inform decisions about how therapists or professionals who are working with those clients may want to change their behavior or their approach depending on that client's sense of safety. And then this last slide is a little bit more about our therapist network. It is free to join. What joining does is it lets you sign up to receive our newsletter, which updates you on study findings. It provides opportunities to participate in research, and we have research opportunities for clinicians who are part of the network, and also opportunities for clinicians to recruit clients to take part in our surveys as well. And we've recently launched our client survey where we've been collecting very similar data to what I showed, but from the client's perspective. And it helps us build this international database of trauma workers. So if you want to join, please just send an email to trauma@indiana.edu and we can go ahead and get you signed up. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacek. I've been taking notes just for some clarifying comments before we open it up to the larger group for dialogue. And one is I neglected to mention, how is it that these data actually impact clinical practice? How is it that the BPQ, for example, can be accessible to a clinician? And what would the BPQ even look like in clinical use? And I wanted to just sort of give an anecdote to say that for me, it's a part of how I do intake. It's a useful psychometric tool that allows me upon intake to have a general indication that a person's symptom profile might correspond to in terms of subdiaphragmatic versus supradiaphragmatic symptomatology that may or may not correspond to the narrative of the patient. And so it actually gives clues, nonverbal clues, just in a preemptive screening. And to that end, helps give possible framing to how my structured clinical interview might unfold. The other comment is how these data then show up in clinical research. You know, the data set itself out of the database has many endless possibilities of papers that can be written upon it. Right now, there are 3 that Jacek and I are working on together. One, of course, is a clinical methodology paper with our colleagues in Europe at the European Association of Body Psychotherapy, looking at the various methods. The other is an LGBT autonomic reactivity paper looking at the autonomic reactivity within LGBT persons. And then the third is I hope to cite some of these data within a white paper that the Somatic Experiencing Research Consortium is actively writing right now. And then finally, when the data that you presented, Jacek, showed that within the therapist self-report, that there are as many as on average 8 therapies that a clinician might employ. That was to say that those 8 therapies might be employed in simultaneity. Is that correct? It's not those were the top 8 therapies. It's the average trauma therapist is using 8 different therapies simultaneously.
That's right.
And that's I think just a huge finding that really shows kind of the multi-method approach that so many clinicians are employing. And yeah, so I want to open it up. We've already got some questions that are coming in from the attendees who are with us live today. And so if you haven't posed your question into the Q&A, please do, and we will take them up bit by bit and one by one. The first question that we have here for us, Jacek, is from Michelle, who says, what kinds of research can we do when online with clients? So that's just a quick shout out to IRBs, which is to say that no one, in terms of good ethics, should do any research with clients online unless it's already a part of an established IRB project. What does that mean? That means that the research project itself has been approved for human subjects testing through an ethics panel that actually have identified any potential risks, and that there is in fact an informed consent process that has been conducted so that the clients themselves are aware that you are doing research with the client. So it's just a bit of a a question about collaboration. Now, that said, therapists can refer patients or clients if they choose on their own to participate in research, even some of our own surveys. Do you want to say a little bit about that, Jacek, including perhaps our Body Mind COVID survey that right now clinicians could invite their patients to participate?
That's right. The Body Mind COVID survey was developed as a collaboration with Kate Volofsky, who's really been leading that project. And what it's doing is it's capturing the experience, the well-being aspects of living in the pandemic on an international scale. And so I don't have a link handy with me for that survey, but perhaps if there's an opportunity for a follow-up email with the participants, I'd be happy to share that.
And you could also find at Disabled Duo on Instagram. The link can be found on their Instagram, along with the Kinsey Instagram. You'll find the link if you want to check out Kinsey Institute and follow us there. And we always put through our social media team at Kinsey Institute any open calls for participation of research through our social media platforms. The next question, are you measuring both practitioner and client to measure any co-regulation in this research? You want to take that one, Jacek?
I do. So co-regulation is a major interest of mine. There's a lot that happens during a therapy session where the client is responding to the therapist responds to the client. Some of that is verbal. A lot of that is not verbal. So one thing that we've been planning and we're hoping to do, I think once we're able to conduct research at the same capacity that we were before the pandemic, is to understand how some of this is playing out in the autonomic states of client and practitioner together. Part of that will be monitoring physiology. Part of that will be monitoring voice. I think one analog to this is some of the work that our group has done with parents and infants. So one thing that we're able to do here at Indiana University is study the aspects of voice in mother's speech that are reflective of safety cues, and looking at how the variability in the voice is related to where the infant goes in terms of their autonomic state, in terms of their behavioral distress. And we're able to find that the voice was quite predictive of those changes in the infants. And what I'd like to do is take that type of research into a therapeutic setting, where now we've got a little bit more of a bidirectional aspect of voice. With the infants, they actually weren't vocalizing very much, and so most of the vocal features were coming from the parent. I think in therapy, what would be really exciting to look at would be that co-regulation of state and how it's reflected in voice by both in both the client and the practitioner.
The next question from Anne: are research opportunities available for unlicensed practitioners? I just completed advanced SE training and will acquire my certificate shortly, and I'm interested in research around SE and ecological anxiety and climate emergency responses. So our surveys actually are open to licensed and non-licensed clinicians. It is a practitioner survey. And so while we do ask for scope of practice questions, and some of the questions that are in the survey itself, it's not delimited to licensed professionals only. So if you wish to become a member by contacting us at trauma@indiana.edu, you would be allowed to participate in the survey research that we have ongoing, regardless of licensure. And then in the chat, I see, oh, I would love it if maybe we could add some faces to the panel so that we have more of a ventral to ventral moment. And maybe Madeline, you could help us with some Q&A, and we could even bring on some of our other panelists to bring either Michael or Pat back, who also might have questions from just within the panel itself. And so Rebecca, maybe you could bring those folks back. And while we're waiting on that, I mean, as you can tell, the TSRC is got its hands and fingers in a lot of pies. So the one thing I would recommend that you do is to indeed follow Kenzie on social, because we'll be sure as findings continue, we'll let you know about those papers as they come out. And so we want to be sure to share any future papers with you. So Rebecca, are you there? Maybe to add?
Yes, I
Okay.
am.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Great.
Kristen Yasek, this is Pat. Now, one of the
Mhm.
questions I have, I'm obviously the research side of it, but also just from a curriculum implications for training and things like that, the research that you've done with therapists and how they actually interact with their clients and the issues that they're dealing with personally as well as with their clients. Any thoughts on how that affects curriculum today, versus how it might have been designed, 10, 15 years ago? Any insights regarding the curriculum side of this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say from a clinical research standpoint, obviously this mirrors a kind of history that repeats itself, which is historically within psychoanalysis or clinical psychology even, there was often this avoidance of looking at mutuality. It was always kind of a doer and done to sort of model, where we didn't even think about therapist countertransference as an important data element in clinical models. That's all changed. The more relational that we have become, not only in all models of clinical care psychologically, but also how we've had a true relational somatic psychotherapy model in recent years, we're looking at really interactive dynamics. And so curriculum not only has to take into consideration that self-regulation has a co-contaminating sort of feature within co-regulation and its experiences, is a part and parcel of a two-body psychology. And so I think there isn't a single curriculum that I've encountered that in recent years doesn't have to take up issues like practitioner burnout, practitioner resilience, practitioner sort of care as a equal and co-contaminating variable when you look at treatment outcomes. Is there anything you want to add to that, Yasik?
I don't think I can particularly speak to curriculum development. It's just not my area. But thanks, Chris.
So I have one of those big questions, Dr. Walling, and Dr. Koch, about we're looking at a wider field that's growing, and it feels like the fact that the body is a part of therapy is now so well established that you can't really ignore it anymore. So, but what do you see as like the impact of this finding that both body-based therapies are so widespread in use and that they're so diverse? So therefore what? How do we lead forward? What does this mean for us? What are some of the things that this implies clinically and field-based,
I can start with that, or you know, Sick,
Sure.
whichever. Okay. So there's two things that come to mind there. One is that we have to think about what are the clinical conundrums that have escaped the efficacy of the models that have been employed historically. And naturally, what you find is that many of the sort of so-called top-down models weren't actually creating a whole lot of symptom relief, nor certainly any transformation for patients who experienced those models longitudinally. And so it left us with this question of like, well, a coherent narrative is necessary but insufficient for change. That symptom reduction is on its own not really going to lead to true healing. And so it has brought us to the examination of what in psychoanalytic terms has always been referred to as unrepresented states or primitive states, which can sound like pejorative ways to describe traumatogenic experience. Ultimately, though, what it has required is that we return to the origins of what is the self in some respects, what Damasio has called, you know, the core self or the true self, as the biological self. You see this in the literature of Shore. You see this in much of the literature of clinicians who write from a neurobiological framework. That if you want to really develop a resilient self, you have to start with the somatic experience of self, because that is the foundation. And I think what we're seeing from a polyvagal perspective is, as Dr. Porges often likes to put it, we are a traumatized species. So these clinical conundrums aren't just occurring in isolation. They are occurring because as significant ecological collapses occur, as we continue to see social institutions fail to meet the demands of our society, trauma is incredibly pervasive and very difficult for us to treat with conventional approaches. And so naturally, the one approach that we have always known about in a clinical informed paradigm, which is different from a totally purely evidence-based paradigm, which has political constraints, is that there are things that work and they're about a kind of relational body-to-body experience. And that's what this research is grounded in, is a theory that actually thinks about the qualities that actually promote, as Dr. Porges likes to put it, health and growth and restoration.
Yeah, and for me, my perspective comes from the research side. And what does it mean for research? And one of the challenges of working with randomized trials with looking at therapy efficacy is that a lot of the time we treat a therapy like it's in a vacuum in order to study it, right? That it is the one therapy that a client is getting. It's structured in some way over a very fixed amount of time. And I think for me, it's humbling to see this kind of data because as a researcher, someone who works on clinical trials, we know as researchers that when we do a clinical trial, we are moving away from what therapy looks like in the real world. But we hope that we can hone in on some important aspect that then we can use to inform clinicians. And clinicians, when they're making choices about which therapy do I learn, which one do I invest in, a lot of the time they do go to the literature and they think about, okay, what is supported? But then the way that they implement that therapy in practice will be eclectic, will be mixed in with other types of modalities that they've learned. And I think for me, it opens up a challenge, and I think a challenge that I'm excited to try to meet, which is to understand that continuum of scientific studies of treatments, which are going to be quite limited, and on the other hand, the very messy, very interactive real world where there are a lot of factors that are a part of therapy. And I think that's part of the frustration that I see in clinicians with research, is that you might take a look at a clinical trial and say, well, that doesn't look like what therapy looks like when I'm working with my clients. And I think we just need to be mindful of that. But it's also a part of needing to move and work within that continuum of understanding how does the structured science relate to the real world and back. And I think it helps us develop better clinical trials to understand that then can be useful for clinicians when they're making choices about what therapy they want to use, when it's used by insurance companies to try to understand what they will support as far as therapies, or policymakers, or to inform business owners who are, making decisions about which therapies will be included as part of their clinic. But I think it's humbling, and again, I think it helps me have a better perspective on what clinical trials mean.
And I'll add to that one quick thing, which is to say, one of the tropes that I like in clinical work is that the therapist is the therapy. Meaning, when we look at common factors research across all psychotherapies, plural, of course, what you identify as the mediating variable that determines treatment outcome is almost always the therapeutic alliance, as it's called. When that's put into biological frameworks, it's often thought about as experience-dependent counselor and client synchronization. In other words, that there are these emerging papers that everyone who knows me personally knows that I'm like a huge fan of, that look at interpersonal neurobiological coupling dynamics, that actually look at therapist to client or therapist to patient brain synchronization. And that there is something to be said for some of the metaphors that are often used within somatic experiencing jargon, which is that we loan our nervous system to the client so that they experience what regulation is really about. Now, of course, that has a lot of dependent variables attached to it. But I think that the ultimate substrate that underlies sort of the relationship that makes something inherently therapeutic is incredibly nuanced. There is no single psychotherapy. There are only psychotherapies, plural. But when we want to research these factors and to think about ways of evolving and growing to help advance trauma healing, we find ourselves in often epistemological debates, which even at the Somatic Experiencing Research Consortium Committee, we can sometimes enjoy from time to time. But this is the kind of stuff that researchers find fun and life-affirming, and that tickles our nerd hearts. So I enjoy it.
Thank you. That's such an enlivening and deep perspective. I'm going to be chewing on that answer for a while. I have a small follow-up question in 4 words, kind of like a Jungian throwing out 4 words. One of them is transdiagnostic. The other one is trans-theoretical. And the other one is ecological validity. And then another one is one that's my own term, which is embodiment validity. in research? I'll just throw those out there and see
Hmm.
if you have any responses to that.
Jacek?
Absolutely. One of the things that I really think a lot about is how do we make the research look more like what's happening in practice? And a lot of the time, that conversation is around that ecological validity. And the randomized control trial comes from a model that fits, say, medication very well, right? You give some people this pill and you give some people that pill and you compare the results. And those are really easy trials to run. And the ecological validity is just around, do they get the pill or that pill? Now, when I'm making decisions and having conversations with therapists about what can a trial look like, we usually start with a conversation about, well, what does this therapy really look like in practice? Who is going to be benefiting from this therapy? Who do you recommend gets this therapy? What kind of outcomes would we want to track? And we find that there's no one t-shirt size for deciding how that trial is going to look, what it's going to use as outcome measures, and what it's going to look like in terms of having a comparison group that's ecologically valid too. And so, that I think phrase resonated with me the most. I'd be very curious about what embodiment validity means, because I think it's one that catches my ear, but I'm not sure if I quite understand it.
I'm not going to do that terrible presenter thing where I ask a question that makes me talk when you all are talking. I'm happy to be quiet.
Well, shout out to your book that you have a chapter in on embodied research methods. If folks haven't read it, they should.
That's very kind, Dr. Wall.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are the big questions, right? These are the questions that require us to be accountable to the methods that we use. That's the kind of intellectual humility that I think we all practice if we are clinician researchers. And it requires us to really be willing to be reflexive in our thinking, that we're open to other ideas, that we hold our ideas loosely, and that we're willing to study them vigorously. And that's why research is just as much a practice as clinical work is. I think if you read some of the textbooks that really illustrate this and the clinical side, there are, contemporary textbooks that I am a fan of within even the field of somatic psychotherapy that talk about two different paradigms of knowledge. One being a clinically informed paradigm, which says that I will do whatever works for my patient within reason and within an ethical frame. The other one says that it's an evidence-based paradigm that requires a certain kind of rigor that, like you're saying, Jacek, has limitations in terms of the ways in which that we randomize it and that we can control for it. And so, this is where looking at more experiential methods like those that Michael and his colleagues have written about in their new book really come into bear. And it requires us to sort of stretch our framework a little bit beyond the RCT as the only holy grail.
Yeah, and then one thing that does make me think about that is on my mind a lot is, we really put RCTs on a pedestal as being the gold standard for showing that something works. But there's so many other types of questions that we can answer with research that aren't just whether the treatment works or not, which can be about who does it work for? In what context does it work? When paired with this, does it work? And we don't need an RCT to answer those. That's data that we can collect with, anyone who wants to participate in research and, has the client base to be able to do that. So I also want to put in a plug for non-RCT research as being crucial.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And also for decolonizing interpretive research, that we really look to subaltern scholars who have literature that guide us on post-colonial studies and the processing of methods in research that allow us to advance scholarly production without recapitulating some of these dynamics through the literature. So any other questions? Either from the panel, from the attendees? I don't see any across the board here. If not, we might call it a bit early.
So, Dr. Walling and Dr. Koach, one more question, and I've realized I'm being a little greedy with my use of question time, but I appreciate your insight and your expertise. I look at somatic therapies overall, and one of my critiques is that there's a wonderful group of people who are evidence-based when they're in the moment, empirical in the moment with the patient, but haven't developed the skills as researchers to be able to kind of cross that gap. And anything that you could offer us as a community for how do we grow to be the culture of research within our community?
You want to take that, Yasik?
I will say that I'm quite new to the somatic experiencing world. My background is in developmental psychology and neuroscience. And so I am hesitant to make any recommendations. What I think I would prefer is to have a conversation and to understand where the strengths are, where you see that empirically based research is strong, and where you think that it could be pulled in a little bit more, and then to think about recommendations. But I think I'm just can't speak intelligently to this at this point.
Yeah, I'll offer just a real quick point or two, which is to say that there are practices that organizations can implement that actually make research less threatening and more accessible. And those practices include things like establishing journal clubs, where people readily take up academic literature and deconstruct it, critique it, and learn to familiarize themselves with what makes good and good enough research. And once these types of practices are taken up within an organization, that allows research to be less esoteric, more meaningful, and to close the gap between the practitioner and the published paper. And I think that that is very much what's behind the creation of things like the International Body Psychotherapy Journal, where it's open to practitioners and clinicians alike. It doesn't sort of try to hold in its peer review standards anything that doesn't actually honor the lived experience of what people are really doing in the room. And then there is one other comment, it looks like, which is, yes, decolonizing approaches are critical. This is part of my way of knowing and doing. Michael Yellowbird, love Michael Yellowbird, and Renee Linkletter speak to this so well. Sean Wilson, Maggie Kovac, and so many speak to it in terms of research as well. Thank you, Kathleen. Absolutely. I'm a big fan of Michael Yellowbird as well. Well, thank you all so much for spending time with us on a Saturday to talk about research. I mean, that's dedication.
Well, and I also want to put a quick plug in for our conference in June, where hopefully we will have some more discussion around research and research papers. We're going to have hopefully a roundtable of more research discussion. And I think part of what we need to look at is how do we demystify research, make it more accessible to those that are not familiar with the lingo, the language, the concepts, but can we use the BPQ in day-to-day practice without having to have a PhD behind our names and be comfortable using it without worrying about, am I doing this wrong? Am I misrepresenting? All those sorts of things. So there's basic things that I think we can all do within our practice and our scope of work that don't require a master's degree in statistics. And how do we make that much more accessible? So I'm hoping that the conference in June, so please sign up, will offer some of those opportunities to become more familiar and less perhaps skittish around research, because I know sometimes it's intimidating. So I would encourage people to do that.
And that, thank you, Dr. Segura. I really appreciate that. And as we're wrapping up here, I'll also say that we are developing a mentorship team that if you have an idea, can either help take that idea off your plate and maybe implement it, or support you with that idea to implement it yourself, or find the right collaborators to do it. And that there is a really important role for case reviews and case studies in research at this point, particularly as the literature develops. We're still at a moment where in one shot or even 10 series case studies that a clinician develops would really enhance the existing literature. So don't be afraid of it. Reach out, get support. I want to say that we have a Peter Levine Award that will be announced very soon for research excellence. We'll have 2 people that we'll get to celebrate both at the conference, and all of the runner-ups were amazing. And we're going to be working at helping them support getting their research out into the world. And Dr. Walling and Dr. Koach, I just want to thank you so much for all of your tremendous leadership, for all the leadership to come, and for an inspiring and enlivening conversation, and being our first. And I know we'll get better at promoting, get better at running these things. And I appreciate you all being willing to give your time so generously to us today.
My pleasure.
Me too.
Have a great rest of your weekend. Stay safe out there.
Bye, everyone.